This love story, twisted beyond recognition, hid dark secrets that no one suspected. Behind the smiles and polite conversation was a man driven by an insatiable lust for conquest and control. He seemed charming, even loving, but his life revolved around a dangerous addiction, one that no vow of love or loyalty could satisfy. Behind closed doors, his darkest desires ruled their relationship. What began as a simple act of defiance soon escalated into violence. In the privacy of their home, the line between love and hate was irrevocably erased. A chilling discovery was made afterward. The police, initially unaware of the gravity of the situation, were confronted with a shocking discovery that changed the lives of those involved forever. Women often fall into the trap of what is known as the savior syndrome, a strong desire to save someone, even at the cost of their own happiness and well-being. This deeply rooted syndrome was what ultimately destroyed the life of a young British woman named Vicky Roberts. For nearly 3 years, she tried, in vain, to reform her husband, Michael Roberts, a man with both sadistic tendencies and a predisposition for infidelity. Despite all her efforts to change him, all Vicky received in return was pain, humiliation, and cruelty. Vicky Roberts, born Victoria Smith, came into the world in September 1984 in Cheshire, located in the northwestern part of England. She was the younger of 2 daughters in a rather conservative and deeply religious family. Vicky and her sister were raised in a Christian environment, attending a Christian school and actively participating in religious activities, such as singing in the choir and practicing music. Vicky was described by those who knew her as a kind-hearted, friendly, and helpful girl who never hesitated to lend a hand to anyone in need. After graduating from high school, Vicky enrolled in a university, taking a job at IKEA to support herself financially while studying. It was there that she met a young man named Michael Roberts, who would later become a central figure in her life. Initially, they were just friends. Michael, only a year older than Vicky, was also working at IKEA while pursuing his education. He was athletic, took care of his appearance, and knew how to present himself in a way that impressed others. At first, Vicky, who was more reserved and shy, found Michael's personality too overbearing. His outgoing nature, constant talking, and intrusive behavior seemed to clash with her own quieter demeanor. But Michael was persistent, and over time, he managed to win Vicky's favor. Michael Roberts came from a family of high achievers. Born in June 1983 in Warrington, Cheshire, he was the eldest of 2 sons, raised in a family where his father worked as a prominent chemical engineer. His parents were strict, holding high expectations for their children, especially Michael, who was seen as the heir to the family's ambitions. Michael excelled in school, was driven, ambitious, and learned how to get what he wanted. Socially, he was popular and charismatic, with a large circle of friends who gravitated toward his charm. He was known to be the life of any party, but perhaps what Michael took the most pride in were his conquests in the realm of romance. Blessed with good looks, standing tall and trim, with a sharp sense of humor and a knack for drawing people in, Michael quickly learned how to charm women. He was smart, well-read, and could hold a conversation on nearly any topic, which only added to his appeal. But beneath the surface, his parents' constant praise and high expectations fostered something darker: a growing narcissistic disorder. Michael had been taught from an early age that he was special, destined for success, and this belief only grew stronger as he matured. However, he was also plagued by an intense fear of disappointing his parents, driving him to maintain an image of perfection in their eyes, even if it meant hiding the truth about his character. Michael never had a steady girlfriend. Instead, he enjoyed having multiple romantic partners at the same time, expertly juggling relationships so that no one woman ever realized she wasn't the only one. He thrived on the thrill of the chase, especially when it came to women who were difficult to win over. To Michael, pursuing unavailable or uninterested women was a game, a challenge that he delighted in conquering. And Vicky, with her modesty and reserved nature, was the perfect target. For Michael, winning her over was simply another conquest in a long line of romantic games. In the beginning, Vicky was determined to keep her distance from Michael. She politely declined even the most innocent of invitations, whether it was to grab a cup of coffee after work or to take a leisurely walk. She had her priorities set: Her studies took up nearly all of her time, and weekends were spent at church. Dating, or even the idea of a romantic relationship, wasn't something she had on her mind. She was focused on her own path and didn't see how a man could fit into it. However, Michael was persistent. It took him months of gentle persistence before Vicky finally agreed to go out with him. And once she did, Michael revealed a side of himself that was utterly charming. He was attentive, sweet, and seemed genuinely devoted to her. He showered her with flowers, thoughtful gifts, and little surprises that made her feel special. As their relationship grew, he even introduced her to his family, inviting her over for dinner. His parents, particularly impressed with Vicky's modesty and kind nature, immediately approved of her, giving their son their full support. Vicky took this as a sign that Michael was serious, and she let her guard down. She gave herself fully to him, and in her heart, she believed she had found her soulmate. Michael became her first and only love, and in those early days, she truly felt she had found her happiness. It seemed like a fairy tale romance from the outside. Both Vicky and Michael were young, attractive, full of energy, and shared big dreams for their future together. They appeared to be a perfect couple, with everything ahead of them. But beneath the surface, things were far from ideal. She soon learned that Michael's true nature was far more disturbing than his charming exterior suggested. Vicky quickly discovered that Michael had a side to him that was hard to ignore. A relentless sexual appetite paired with a strong desire for experimentation in bed. At first, he took it slow, not wanting to scare Vicky away. He feared she might leave if he revealed this side of himself too soon. But once he felt secure that she was his, he began to push boundaries. The modest, religious Vicky was completely unprepared for what followed. Michael's interests in the bedroom went far beyond what she had ever imagined, and the things he introduced her to shocked her deeply. Yet, despite her discomfort, she was in love, deeply in love, and so she trusted him. For a long time, Vicky kept the details of their intimate life to herself. She didn't tell anyone about the activities that took place behind their closed bedroom door. Michael had proposed to her, and she believed, or perhaps desperately hoped, that once they were married, things would calm down, that he would leave these strange desires behind and settle into a more traditional life. The man she hoped to change was not someone who could be reshaped through love or patience, but the signs of Michael's behavior started to show in other ways. One of Vicky's closest friends began to notice that Vicky was hiding small bruises and marks on her body, covering them with clothes or makeup. Concerned, the friend pressed her for answers, wondering if Michael was physically abusing her. Vicky tried to brush it off, but after some coaxing, she eventually opened up. She confessed that the bruises were a result of Michael's intimate experiments. His passion for bondage and the use of various toys and devices had escalated, and she found herself increasingly overwhelmed. Vicky even shared a troubling detail. Michael's appetite for intimacy was insatiable. Their intimate encounters happened up to 5 times a day, and still, he was never fully satisfied. For Michael, sex wasn't just an act. It was an art form, a way for him to express himself. He took pride in being what he considered a skillful lover. While Vicky sometimes refused to participate in certain dangerous or extreme acts, Michael often found ways to convince her otherwise, playing on her love for him. In time, Vicky graduated, defending her diploma, and decided it was time for a fresh start in her professional life. She took a job as an account manager at a logistics company, hoping this new chapter would bring some balance to her life. Michael, too, left IKEA and began working as a sales consultant at a large electronics retailer. With his natural charisma and persuasive abilities, Michael thrived in his new role. He quickly became one of the top performers in his store, consistently exceeding sales targets. It wasn't long before he was promoted to a senior sales position, and management began considering him for a move to the company's head office. But before such a promotion could happen, Michael needed to undergo further training and improve his qualifications. Michael loved the attention and sense of importance that came with his new position. He relished the opportunity to attend training sessions and go on business trips to London, basking in the recognition he was receiving. In these moments of professional success, Michael seemed to forget about Vicky. Their once frequent conversations dwindled, and they rarely spent time together outside of the bedroom. To Michael, Vicky seemed to disappear from his life, only resurfacing when he needed her for his insatiable desires. Their relationship began to lose all semblance of normalcy. There were no longer any meaningful discussions, shared activities, or mutual interests. Michael's focus had shifted entirely to his career, and Vicky became nothing more than a convenience. As his attention drifted further from her, Michael began to indulge in affairs with women he encountered at work, colleagues, clients, and even casual acquaintances. While Vicky was still clinging to the hope that their relationship could return to what it once was, Michael had moved on, emotionally and physically. What had started as a dream-like romance was now unraveling, and Vicky was left to navigate the painful realization that the man she loved was no longer the person she thought he was. Michael was completely consumed by his obsession with intimacy, to the point where it seemed to define his very sense of self-worth. His confidence and identity were tied to his ability to seduce and maintain multiple relationships, and every new conquest boosted his ego. At the height of his obsession, Vicky discovered she was pregnant. Overjoyed, she eagerly shared the news with her fiancé, thinking that the time had come to move forward with their long-delayed wedding and start a family. To her, this was a moment of celebration, a new chapter for both of them. But instead of happiness, Michael reacted with anger. He exploded, insisting that they were far too young to have children and that becoming parents would ruin their lives. He demanded that she terminate the pregnancy, claiming it was the only sensible thing to do. Vicky was heartbroken and shocked by Michael's reaction. She had envisioned a future where they would raise a child together, but now her dream was crumbling. Refusing to even consider an abortion, she stood her ground. But Michael, ever the manipulator, changed his tactics. He began to play on her insecurities, warning that her deeply religious parents would be furious if they found out their beloved daughter was pregnant out of wedlock. He argued that they could avoid the scandal by quietly ending the pregnancy, promising that after they got married, they would have children in the future, when the time was right. Michael's words gnawed at Vicky's heart, and despite her better judgment, she eventually caved to the pressure. She agreed to the abortion, hoping it would ease the tension between them and pave the way for the future Michael had promised. The procedure, however, didn't go smoothly. Complications arose, forcing Vicky to stay in the hospital for several days. Her recovery was slow, and for nearly 3 weeks, doctors ordered her to avoid any physical strain, including intimacy. This enraged Michael. Instead of being concerned for her health, he spiraled into frustration, unable to cope with the sudden halt in their intimate life. Vicky, finally starting to see the darker depths of her fiancé's character, realized that Michael's addiction to sex wasn't just a quirk, it was a full-blown obsession. She could no longer deny the reality that he was emotionally unstable and dangerously fixated on his desires. Michael's behavior became more erratic. He started leaving the house every day, using work as an excuse. Vicky suspected he was seeking intimacy elsewhere, but despite everything, she clung to the hope that marriage would change him. She convinced herself that once they were married, she could help him overcome his issues, believing in the possibility of reform, even as the evidence mounted against it. The engagement dragged on for nearly 2 years, during which time Michael showed little interest in formalizing their relationship. He seemed perfectly content with the status quo, having Vicky at home to fulfill his needs, while continuing to pursue other women in secret. Vicky, ever forgiving and trusting, overlooked his infidelities. Even when she found evidence of his cheating, she accepted his empty promises that it would never happen again. But as time wore on, Vicky's patience began to wear thin. She wanted a proper family, and her parents, as well as Michael's, were becoming increasingly insistent about the wedding. Michael's parents, in particular, adored Vicky and believed she was the perfect match for their son. They frequently inquired about the wedding date and were eager to have grandchildren. Eventually, under the pressure from both sides, Michael agreed to the wedding. It was a grand affair, A picture-perfect ceremony with a white dress, a limousine, and an outdoor celebration that left their families beaming with pride. The couple appeared deeply in love, and to outsiders, it seemed like the beginning of a bright future together. No one suspected the turmoil that lay beneath the surface, nor the secrets Vicky had been keeping about Michael's troubling behavior. They moved into a large, comfortable house in a prestigious part of Warrington, close to Michael's parents. On the surface, their lives seemed to be flourishing, but the reality was far different. Michael's feelings toward Vicky had never truly been those of love. For him, their marriage was nothing more than a cover, a way to appear normal to his family and the outside world. Vicky, ever the loyal wife, kept silent about his strange sexual preferences and his ongoing infidelities. She believed in her marriage vows and hoped that with time, she could help her husband become the man she once thought he was. Meanwhile, Michael continued to lead his double life, changing mistresses as easily as one might change clothes, with Vicky none the wiser. Professionally, Michael was thriving. He received another promotion and began earning a substantial income. With his new responsibilities, he was transferred to a different office where he worked under Carrie Hall, the head of administration at Phones. Carrie was a striking woman, 10 years older than Michael, and had been divorced for several years, raising her son on her own. She was confident, attractive, and assertive, qualities that Michael found irresistibly appealing. For a time, Carrie paid little attention to Michael's flirtations, dismissing them as harmless banter. But Michael, determined to conquer yet another woman, turned on the full force of his charm. He was relentless, and eventually, Carrie succumbed to his advances. Their affair was intense, passionate, and filled with the kind of experimentation that Michael craved but never dared suggest to Vicky. Carrie, a mature woman who knew what she wanted, was flattered by the attention of a younger man. She enjoyed their secret rendezvous in hotel rooms, where they could indulge in fantasies that Michael couldn't explore with his wife. To Carrie, their affair was thrilling and liberating. To Michael, it was an escape from the constraints of his marriage. He constantly fed Carrie lies about how miserable he was with Vicky, painting himself as a victim trapped in a loveless union. He even claimed he wanted a divorce, but that his wife refused to give him one, a fabrication that allowed him to justify his ongoing betrayal. All the while, Vicky remained blissfully unaware of the extent of Michael's deceit, still holding on to the hope that their marriage would eventually bring them the happiness she had always dreamed of. Michael's affair with Carrie continued for over a year. But Carrie, being an older and more experienced woman, never harbored any illusions about their relationship. She didn't press him for a divorce and seemed content with their secret meetings in hotel rooms. The arrangement suited her well enough, allowing her to maintain her independence while indulging in Michael's dangerous games. However, things were not as simple as they appeared. Soon after their affair began, Carrie started wearing clothing that was highly uncharacteristic for her. Long sleeves and high collars, which covered her body more than she ever had before. A fitness enthusiast who loved showing off her toned figure, this sudden change was puzzling to those who knew her well. When one of her close friends asked about the shift, Carrie hesitantly revealed the reason: Michael's bedroom experiments. She admitted that Michael's intimate fantasies often spiraled out of control, venturing into territory that was far from safe. As proof, she showed her friend a deep bite mark on her chest, one of Michael's passionate acts. On her neck, bruises from his hands were visible, and her wrists bore rope burns, a result of Michael's habit of binding her tightly, taking pleasure in having complete control over her. Carrie's friend was horrified and immediately urged her to report Michael to the police. But Carrie, almost nonchalant about the matter, dismissed the suggestion. She explained that their relationship was consensual, and most of the time, Michael would at least warn her about what he was going to do. Yet, even she admitted that sometimes things would escalate too far, too fast. For example, Michael loved to strangle his partner, telling her that it would intensify the experience. Though she agreed at first, there were times when he got so caught up that she actually lost consciousness. Vicky, too, had experienced this during their marriage. Strangulation terrified her, But her love for Michael led her to believe that these dangerous games would eventually stop. She held on to the hope that he would tire of such behavior, or that she herself would become desensitized to it, accepting it as a normal part of their relationship. Tragically, neither Vicky nor Carrie made any serious attempts to stop Michael's increasingly dangerous desires. Even before her marriage, Vicky had her suspicions about Michael's infidelity. Deep down, she knew that he had a compulsive need for variety and excitement. But she naively hoped that marriage would change him, that her love and devotion could transform Michael from a reckless philanderer into a committed husband. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. After their wedding, Michael became even more brazen in his cheating, though he adamantly denied it whenever confronted. He was so skilled at manipulation that Vicky often doubted her own instincts. Eventually, she could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. One night, while Michael was asleep, she took his phone and began combing through his messages. What she found shattered her. There were explicit texts between Michael and several women, including Carrie, as well as other girls he had been seeing behind her back. Some of the messages contained intimate photographs exchanged between Michael and his various lovers, leaving no room for doubt about his infidelity. Devastated, Vicky decided she had to leave. She packed a small bag and moved in with a close friend, too ashamed and heartbroken to tell her parents or siblings what had happened. Her family believed her marriage was perfect, and she feared that revealing the truth would force them to pressure her into filing for divorce. And despite everything, Vicky was still in love with Michael. She didn't want to let him go just yet. Before leaving, Vicky poured her heart into a handwritten letter, which she left on the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet. In the letter, she expressed her deep love for Michael, calling him the most important person in her life. But she also confessed that she knew about his cheating and couldn't tolerate it anymore. She explained that she was leaving to give him time to think about his actions, though she was not yet ready to file for divorce. She still clung to the hope that Michael would realize what he was losing and change for the better. Michael, however, was neither touched nor saddened by Vicky's departure. What he did care about was not losing the convenient, submissive wife who quietly waited for him at home, cooking his meals and tolerating his behavior without protest. That evening, he followed Vicky to her friend's house, showing up with a large bouquet of flowers. He knelt before her, begged for her forgiveness, and promised that she would be his one and only from that point forward. Desperate for things to go back to the way they were, Vicky believed him. Again, she returned home with Michael, hopeful that this time, things would truly change. Predictably, nothing changed. Michael continued his affair with Carrie, as well as with other women, but he became much more cautious in covering his tracks. He started coming home for dinner more often, putting on the facade of a caring husband. He hid his phone, deleted incriminating messages, and even changed the password on his social media accounts. But while he made these superficial adjustments at home, he was already pursuing someone new, Karen Wilson, a young employee at his company. Karen, at the time, was engaged and planning her own wedding, but that didn't stop Michael. He persistently pursued her, painting himself as a miserable man trapped in an unhappy marriage. He played the role of the misunderstood lover, using every trick in his book to win her over. After 2 months of relentless pursuit, Michael succeeded. He ended his relationship with Carrie, telling her that their time together had run its course. Carrie, 10 years older and tired of the secrecy, accepted the breakup without much fuss. Michael, meanwhile, focused all his attention on Karen Wilson. He convinced her to break off her engagement, assuring her that he was in the process of divorcing Vicky. Karen, completely taken by Michael's charm and lies, believed him. Their relationship quickly intensified, with their first intimate encounter happening right in the office. Karen waited patiently for Michael to finalize his divorce, but what she didn't know was that he had no intention of leaving Vicky. Instead, he continued to string Karen along with false promises, telling her he had moved in with his parents while the divorce was being processed. Karen, smitten and unaware of the extent of Michael's deceit, believed every word. Vicky had long suspected that Michael was continuing to cheat on her, but this time, she decided to gather solid proof. One evening, while Michael was in the shower, she seized the opportunity to check his phone. However, to her dismay, she found nothing incriminating. Michael had learned from past mistakes. He had deleted all his text messages and even changed the password on his social media accounts. Vicky wasn't deterred. She waited until her husband was sound asleep, then took his work laptop, which he always kept close. To her surprise, he had forgotten to log out of his social media. There, she found a string of incriminating messages exchanged with a new girlfriend. In those messages, Michael professed his love, claimed he was divorcing Vicky, and told the woman he was living with his parents. For Vicky, this discovery was nothing short of a devastating shock. Not willing to let the betrayal go unnoticed this time, Vicky took screenshots of the messages and saved them on her own laptop. She knew she needed proof if she ever wanted to confront him. While still in a state of disbelief, she rifled through Michael's wallet, finding several folded receipts from various hotel stays. It all pointed to the same thing. Her husband had been leading a double life once again. The next morning, armed with her newfound evidence, Vicky decided it was time for confrontation. For the first time in their entire relationship, she unleashed her anger on Michael. She showed him the screenshots of his love notes to his mistress and the hotel receipts, finally giving voice to the betrayal she had kept bottled up inside for so long. Michael, caught off guard, scrambled to apologize, offering the same tired promises that he would change. But Vicky, no longer willing to accept his lies, did something that shook him. She threatened to tell his parents everything. For Michael, this was an unthinkable move. The thought of his parents learning about his infidelity terrified him, and Vicky knew that. Enraged by her threat, he lashed out in a violent rage. Without warning, he slapped her across the face. But Vicky didn't back down. Still furious, she turned and announced that she was going to tell his parents immediately. She headed toward the door, but Michael was faster. In a split second, he grabbed a heavy jewelry box from the dresser and struck her twice in the head. Vicky collapsed, losing consciousness almost instantly. Panic set in, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Fueled by rage, Michael wrapped his hands around her neck and strangled her until she stopped breathing. In the aftermath, Michael felt no guilt, no remorse. Coldly, he wrapped Vicky's lifeless body in a blanket, then placed it in several large garbage bags. He carried the body into the garage and stuffed it in the corner, out of sight. His next steps were calculated. He methodically cleaned the house, erasing any signs of a struggle. Then, he packed up some of Vicky's personal belongings, making it look as though she had left voluntarily. Later that evening, as if nothing had happened, Michael called his mistress, Karen, and invited her over. They shared dinner and spent the night together in the very house where Michael had just murdered his wife. Karen was oblivious to the horror that had unfolded mere hours before. She even spent the night in the same bedroom where the murder had taken place, completely unaware of the gruesome secret Michael was hiding. The following day, Michael put his plan into motion. He went to his parents' house and, in an Oscar-worthy performance, sobbed on his mother's shoulder, telling them that Vicky had left him. He showed them messages, ones he had sent himself from Vicky's phone, claiming she had run off with another man. Michael's parents were heartbroken and confused, unable to understand how their sweet, religious daughter-in-law could have done such a thing. Simultaneously, Michael used Vicky's phone to send similar messages to her own parents. In these messages, he claimed that she had fallen in love with someone else, had left with him, and needed time and space. Concerned, Vicky's parents immediately tried to contact her, but every time they called, the phone was either rejected or they received cold, detached texts asking for time. Suspicion gnawed at them. Something felt off, so they went to Michael's house to confront him. But his story, though full of holes, still managed to raise more doubts than answers. The fact that Vicky had stopped going to work without any explanation led her parents to go to the police. On December 1, 2009, Michael took steps to cover his tracks further. He bought a shovel, several meters of rope, and cleaning supplies. His plan was simple: bury the body and erase any lingering evidence. But fate intervened before he could carry out his grisly task. That same day, the police arrived at his house for a welfare check, acting on the concerns raised by Vicky's parents. Though nothing immediately suspicious was found, Michael's behavior raised questions. The officers left, but they missed one crucial clue: the large, suspiciously placed package in the corner of the garage. During a cursory inspection, police noted the absence of any of Vicky's clothing or personal belongings, but Vicky's laptop was on the table, which was strange given Michael's statement that she had left. Vicky's laptop, left unattended, was seized by the police. When they examined it, they found the screenshots of Michael's messages to his mistress that Vicky had saved as proof of his cheating. The police quickly became suspicious. A geolocation search of Vicky's phone revealed that it had never left their home, despite Michael's claims that she had been texting from elsewhere. Law enforcement returned for a more thorough search. This time, they unwrapped the strange package in the garage and made the horrifying discovery: Vicky's body. By then, Michael had vanished. He had fled with his wallet, containing enough cash to allow him to evade capture for several days. With his money running out, Michael sought refuge at the home of another mistress, Lavinia T., who allowed him to stay the night. That evening, Lavinia saw the news about Michael's involvement in his wife's murder. Horrified, she immediately contacted the authorities, who arrived shortly thereafter to arrest him. When police finally apprehended him, Michael was crying, maintaining his innocence. He insisted that Vicky's death had been an accident, claiming that during one of their intimate games, she had asked him to strangle her with a rope belt, but he had gone too far. However, forensic evidence told a different story. The autopsy revealed that Vicky had been strangled by bare hands, not a belt, and that she had been attacked from behind. 2 large hematomas on her head, which had been inflicted while she was still alive, further discredited his claims. The evidence made it clear that Vicky's death had not been an accident, but a cold-blooded murder. The trial began in January 2010, with Michael pleading for leniency, continuing to claim that Vicky's death was unintentional. But the autopsy results and overwhelming evidence of his premeditated actions left no room for doubt. Michael Roberts was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 17 years. If released, he could walk free as early as 2027. She was one of those women who saw the good in everyone, even in those whom others might not notice. Her life, although not remarkable, was filled with compassion and warmth, traits that attracted everyone who knew her to her. However, ironically, it was her kindness that led to her death. No one could have foreseen that opening her house to a stranger would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the lives of her family and friends. Then, one night, she disappeared. The sudden silence, the calls that no one answered, and the empty house immediately caused concern for her loved ones. What they found when they went looking for her was more terrifying than they could have imagined. Inside the untouched house, where there were no signs of a struggle, a chilling story began to unfold. As the investigation deepened, the truth emerged that revealed the grim reality of unfounded trust and deception. This was followed by a dark and confusing story of betrayal, violence, and a chilling confession. Her body was found in the woods, in a place where the casual passerby would not even wander in by mistake. The decomposed remains were so disfigured that the victim could only be identified by dental records. Britney Tavar was once full of life and plans, but fate had cruelly deceived her. Those who knew this woman could not believe that she was the victim of such a heinous betrayal from a man she trusted. At first glance, her killer did not pose any danger. An ordinary man with a polite smile and sad eyes. But behind this mask lurked a heartless predator, ready for any betrayal for his own benefit. Britney Tavar, a 45-year-old resident of picturesque St. Augustine, Florida, was someone you couldn't help but love. Her kindness and helpfulness seemed to attract people to her, lighting up their lives with her warmth. Despite the distance between her and her family, she always found time to talk to them, sharing her concerns and receiving support in return. Those who knew Britney were sure she had a true gift for helping others. But, as is often the case, bright qualities can become fatal. It was her desire to help that caused a tragedy that forever changed the lives of those close to her. As a young girl, Britney dreamed of Hollywood. Having an attractive appearance and soft character, she hoped to find her place in the world of cinema. However, despite her efforts, the dream of becoming an actress remained unfulfilled. Disappointed in a career in show business, Britney returned to her native saint, Augustine. There, she decided to engage in real estate and photography, and in this field, she found her calling. Her work as a real estate agent allowed her not only to earn successfully, but also to gain a reputation as a reliable and conscientious professional. Her natural charm and ability to find a common language with people made her a sought-after specialist. Over the years, Britney became a well-known figure in her town. She had a successful career, a cozy home, and a measured albeit lonely life. One of the few places where she allowed herself to relax was the beach club, Serenade, located on the ocean. It was there that she made many acquaintances, made friends, and escaped a bit of loneliness. But no one could have guessed that her kindness and openness hid a vulnerability that would be exploited by someone with dark intentions. Britney always believed in people, which was her fatal mistake. On one of the usual days for Britney, July 6, 2010, she went about her business as usual, kept in touch with friends, and maintained her cheerful attitude. In the evening, she decided to unwind a bit and went to meet her friends. Britney was friendly, sweet, and as usual, radiated positivity. But despite her good mood, she didn't plan to linger and left the party around 9 p.m. After getting behind the wheel of her Toyota RAV4, she headed to the nearest gas station, where she filled up a full tank and then headed home. No one could have imagined that it would be her last night. For the next 2 days, Britney seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. The phone was silent, and messages went unanswered. The first alarming calls came from friends who had seen her at the party and expected to see her the next day. Punctual and always attentive to communication, Britney disappeared without leaving a single word. This was completely out of character for her. Britney was noted for her discipline and always communicated if her plans changed. When she didn't show up or respond to a single message, concern began to turn to fear. Britney's friend Brenda, along with a few others, decided to drive to her house. The family, who lived on the other side of the country, were also on the verge of panic. When they arrived, they immediately noticed a disturbing detail. Britney's car wasn't in its usual spot. Maybe she had simply left, but then why had she been ignoring calls and staying out of touch for days? The house looked the same as it always did. No mess, no forced entry, no signs of struggle. Everything was in its place, except for one thing. The landlady didn't answer the knock at the door. Britney lived with 2 dogs and 2 cats, and usually, the animals could be seen through the window or heard barking. But when the friends listened, they heard only the faint meowing of the cats from inside the house. The dogs, on the other hand, seemed to have vanished along with Britney. It wasn't just an oddity, it was a signal that something had gone terribly wrong. After all, she would never leave her pets unattended without asking for help. There was still no way to contact Britney, and the anxiety among her loved ones was growing by the minute. The situation was becoming more and more sinister and mysterious. Her friends, realizing that something was clearly wrong, called her sister and decided to act. It was urgent to get inside the house, at least to feed the hungry cats and understand what was going on. To do this, they called a locksmith to pick the lock. Upon entering the house, they were confronted with something unexpected and frightening. The first thing that caught their eye was the sterile cleanliness. Usually, Britney's house, because of the presence of animals, was a bit of a mess. Scattered toys, paw prints, and hair. But now everything was sparkling. The floors, the furniture, even the windows. The smell of cleaning products was as strong as if the house had just been cleaned. There seemed to be something sinister behind this perfect cleanliness. The cats, though hungry, were too calm, as if the presence of the owner of the house had not changed anything. This moment added even more mystery to what was happening. Another strange observation was the icy breath of the air conditioner running at full blast. The house was incredibly cold, which was not at all in keeping with Britney's habits. She had always been frugal and never left the air conditioner on if she left the house, much less for long. It suggested that someone was trying to disguise or hide something with that unhealthy chill. After looking around the house and finding no obvious traces or answers, the friends went to the police and filed a missing persons report. However, the police met them with typical indifference. They explained that a grown woman can go wherever she wants and does not have to report to anyone. It was only after Britney's brothers and sister, who had hired a private detective, joined the search that the case moved forward. Over time, the family and the detective managed to convince the police of the seriousness of the situation. When the officers finally arrived at the house and conducted a thorough inspection, they encountered the same thing again: perfect cleanliness and the absence of any clues. But everything together, the strange cleaning, the coldness of the house, the calm behavior of the cats, created a disturbing and alarming atmosphere. It all hinted that something dark and creepy was behind Britney's disappearance. Police began to thoroughly search the area around Britney's house. She seemed to have no enemies. The woman led a quiet, measured life, avoided conflict, and had no criminal connections. She had no bad habits or mental disorders. However, one of her friends shared disturbing information. Shortly before her disappearance, Britney's relationship with her neighbor began to deteriorate, which resulted in a serious conflict. Britney began to complain to her friends that the new neighbors were causing many inconveniences. The noise, disorder, and unwillingness to obey her rules turned her home into a zone of constant conflict. Friendships that once seemed strong began to crumble under the pressure of mounting tension. It all started about a month before her disappearance, when Britney took in a woman named Ann Ledden. It was in her nature to help those in need of support, and more than once, she had opened the doors of her home to such people. At first, their relationship had been friendly, but gradually it began to escalate until it became a real feud. The neighbor became more and more aggressive, and soon the situation got out of control. The conflict culminated in a fight, after which Britney was arrested. Ann filed a police report against her, claiming that it was Britney who initiated the aggression. Britney, for her part, insisted that the fight occurred when she demanded that the couple leave her house. According to her, Ann and her boyfriend refused to leave and even attacked her, forcing her to defend herself. The incident was a turning point. Britney spent the night at the station, received probation, mandatory anger management classes, and community service. What's more, she was forbidden to go near Ann and her companion. Witnesses claimed that they regularly quarreled, and sometimes it came to open clashes. The conflict culminated in Britney's attempt to go to court to get a restraining order against Ann, whose behavior was becoming threatening and inappropriate. Britney began to seriously fear for her life and sought to defend herself legally. She was gathering documents and evidence, preparing for a trial, hoping to finally put an end to the constant stress. But the story didn't end there. Ironically, Ann decided not to disappear from Britney's life. Instead, she joined the same beach club, Serenade, together with her boyfriend, where Britney spent a lot of time. The constant meetings turned the former friends into sworn enemies. Britney told friends that Ann deliberately provoked her by behaving aggressively and defiantly. Tired of the threats and constant pressure, Britney decided to seek legal protection. She began gathering evidence to back up her accusations in court. Britney even bought a small video camera to record all her meetings with Ann. She was able to capture several moments that she believed confirmed hostile actions on the part of her former friend. However, one day during another confrontation, Ann noticed the camera and threw it into the pool in a rage. This act only strengthened Britney's resolve to see it through. But it all came to an abrupt end on the eve of the trial. Britney disappeared, leaving behind only unsettling hints and unfinished plans. Could Ann really have gone that far? Or is there something much darker to this story? The hearing Britney had so hoped for was to be held the day after that ill-fated party. Her friends later confirmed that the woman had left early, had not consumed any alcohol, and clearly had no intention of staying late, all to get a good night's sleep and prepare for the important court hearing. Britney intended to get a permanent restraining order against Anne, who was literally stalking her. In this case, the former neighbor looked more than suspicious and had a real motive to get rid of Britney to avoid unpleasant consequences in court. This new information drew the attention of police officers to the neighbor. A theory arose that Anne could have been involved in Britney's disappearance. Her strange behavior and abrupt changes in her relationship with the missing woman made them think that something more serious might have happened between them. Law enforcers decided to interrogate Anne to find out how the conflict developed and if she had any motives for more drastic actions. What was even more disturbing was the absence of any trace of Britney. There were no ransom demands or obvious clues that could point to her whereabouts. When the police called Anne in for questioning, her demeanor surprised the detectives. She remained calm, openly cooperative, and confidently denied her involvement in Britney's disappearance. Anne told her version of events. According to her, she had been a close friend of Britney's in the past, and they had even helped each other at work. Everything changed when Anne reported that her boyfriend from Ireland was going to visit her. The man decided to move to the United States to start a new life with Anne. The main problem was housing, and then the friend turned to Britney with a request to shelter them for a while. Despite the fact that it was a complete stranger whom Britney did not even know, she agreed to help. However, soon after living together, things got heated. But Anne and her boyfriend had a solid alibi that could be confirmed. Nevertheless, no one was in a hurry to exclude her from the list of suspects. There were no other leads yet, but an unexpected development soon led the investigation to another state. In Hopkins, South Carolina, both of Britney's dogs were found wandering aimlessly through different parts of the city. They had collars with tags, and the local veterinary clinic, after running a background check, discovered that the dogs were from Florida and belonged to the missing woman. This discovery came as a surprise and exposed even more questions. How did the animals end up so far from home? The police took them away, hoping that at least this trail would lead to a clue. But even here, they were disappointed. No useful information could be obtained. As a result, the dogs were handed over to a shelter where they would stay until the fate of their owner was clarified. At this point, detectives emphasized that Britney's kindness and compassion may have played tricks on her. Over the years, she had helped many people by providing temporary shelter without asking for payment. Those she gave shelter to usually repaid her with help around the house, cleaning, cooking, tending the garden. But what if, among those she let into her home, was someone with dark intentions? The last person she offered a place to live turned out to be 26-year-old Joseph Roberts. They had met just weeks before her disappearance, meeting by chance at a local bookstore. As always, Britney quickly realized that the guy needed help and decided to be sympathetic. Perhaps it was this act of kindness that proved fatal to her. Their conversation began with the usual polite phrases, but after a few minutes, Joseph went into the story of his tragic fate. He shared with Britney how he became homeless after losing his job at a gas station near the beach. The young man's sad situation did not leave her indifferent. Good-natured Britney, known for her helpfulness, offered him a temporary home so he could get out of the hole and start a new life. All she asked in return was a little help around the house. Joseph quickly fit into Britney's social circle. She even introduced him to her friends at the Serenade Club, where he impressed everyone as a quiet, humble, and friendly guy. To her, he became something like a little brother, someone she always wanted to take care of. She saw in him a man unjustly offended by fate, and having grown up in a large family, could not stay away. Joseph talked about his difficult childhood, full of cruelty and deprivation, and this only strengthened her desire to help. In his revelations, he confessed that he was afraid to stay on the streets, feeling helpless, and considered Britney his salvation from death in a world where he had nothing to look forward to but new suffering. However, the deeper the detectives delved into the story, the darker it seemed. Britney did try to help Joseph. She bought him a computer so he could learn web design and even helped her with her work. But the police soon began to suspect that something else was lurking behind that friendly mask. A turning point in the investigation came when it was discovered that just days after Britney's disappearance, Joseph had been arrested in Evanston, Wyoming for speeding. He was traveling in an automobile owned by Britney herself and was alone. The police officer then limited himself to a warning and let him go because, at that time, the woman's disappearance had not yet been reported. This incident may have given the perpetrator an opportunity to escape and cover his tracks. With each new detail, the picture grew darker and darker. It seemed that the man Britney had thought of as a brother and saved from harm might have been her executioner. But the evidence was still fuzzy, and one could only wonder how deeply Joseph might have been involved in this dark story. The more thoroughly detectives investigated the last days of Britney's life, the clearer it became that Joseph Roberts had become the central figure in this sinister case. His behavior and connection to the missing woman began to cause investigators increasing concern. First and foremost, Joseph appeared to be the last person to see Britney alive on the evening of July 6th, after she returned from a party. She reportedly returned home after a stop at a gas station and met up with him. Also, Joseph began using her car almost immediately after her disappearance, which looked extremely suspicious. In an attempt to clarify the situation, police officers tracked his movements after the traffic stop. That same day, Joseph was spotted at Walmart, where he purchased a tent, a black t-shirt, and shorts. Given his financial difficulties and lack of a permanent residence, these purchases seemed inappropriate, especially after Britney had provided him with shelter. In examining Britney's bank card transactions, investigators discovered that Joseph had used her card to make purchases. This confirmed that he had, at the very least, robbed her. Further investigation revealed that after Britney's disappearance, he regularly used her card in different states, ruthlessly spending her funds. Suspicions of his involvement in her disappearance only increased. As soon as Joseph disappeared from police sight, a vigorous campaign to find him began. The police put him on a federal wanted list, fearing that he might be armed and dangerous. At the same time, despite the efforts of law enforcement, the chances of finding Britney alive were rapidly diminishing by the day. Family and friends of the missing woman put pressure on the police to speed up the search and bring in additional resources. They feared that any delay could cost Britney her life and could not accept the idea that her fate depended on the thoroughness of the investigators, and time was running out. The active search for Joseph Roberts ended on October 12th, when he was apprehended in Seattle on a shoplifting charge. This information was immediately relayed to investigators working on the Britney Tavar case. With many still hoping that Britney might be alive and being held captive, it was speculated that Joseph's purchase of the tent might indicate that it was being used for shelter. Unfortunately, hopes for the best proved futile. During questioning, Joseph quickly and coldly revealed the shocking truth. According to him, on the night of July 6, 2010, after Britney returned from a party, there was an intense conflict between them. Joseph claimed that Britney had insulted him by sharply rebuking him for his poor hygiene and foul odor. The insults were so painful that they drove him to his breaking point. Unable to bear the insults, Joseph took a hammer and began to strike Britney's head. She fell to the floor, suffering from bleeding and difficulty breathing. He did not stop there, but went to the kitchen, took a large knife, and returned to stab her fatally in the neck. At this point, he said he was overwhelmed with fierce anger and wanted only one thing: that Britney never speak again. Afterward, Joseph saw the chaos he had caused. The room was drenched in blood. Spatter from the hammer stained the floor and walls, and his hands and clothes were covered in blood. Realizing that the evidence of the crime had to be covered up, he set about cleaning it up. The pool of blood under the body continued to grow. Joseph wrapped Britney's head and upper body in several trash bags. He used towels, rags, and whatever he found at hand to wipe up the evidence. All evidence was thrown in the trash, and the bloodstains were destroyed with cleaning products found in the house. These horrifying details made the investigation even darker and more shocking. Now the investigators' task was not only to find justice for Britney, but also to understand how her kindness and trust could have led to such a horrible outcome. While Joseph searched in vain for a way to dispose of the body, his disposal plan was not as simple as he expected. At first, he decided to hide the body in the attic of the house. But soon he realized that the corpse was too heavy and awkward to climb the stairs. Joseph then wrapped the body in sheets and several trash bags before carrying it to the trunk of Britney's car. He left the car with the corpse in the trunk until dawn so as not to attract the attention of nosy neighbors. The plan was simple. As soon as it got dark, he would drive away from the crime scene so as not to leave any traces. However, when Joseph got to his next decision, he was faced with an unexpected question. Why did he take Britney's dogs but leave the cats? According to him, the dogs were acting nervous and restless, which could lead to an early detection of the crime. So, Joseph decided to take them with him and dump them near where he was going to hide the body. He left the cats behind, believing that they would not cause any problems and could survive on the street without drawing attention to what had happened. After Joseph finished cleaning up, he put the dogs in the car and drove to a remote wooded area near Interstate 95. Deep into the woods, he attempted to bury the body, but, lacking the proper tools, soon realized it was nearly impossible. After several futile attempts to dig a grave with his bare hands, he simply dumped the body on the ground, hoping it would be destroyed by wild animals and time would do its work. On the way back, Joseph released the dogs, which immediately scattered in different directions, disappearing into the woods. Then he returned to Britney's house and went to bed without any bitterness, as if nothing had happened. The morning after, he regained some consciousness. Joseph realized that the search for Britney would begin soon and decided to leave town immediately in her car. He took all the cash and valuables he found in the house, as well as a bank card he was already familiar with, having used it several times for purchases. Joseph crossed several states, constantly fearing that the police were already watching him, but his escape could not last forever. When the money dried up, he returned to his old occupation, stealing. It was at this point, when he once again tried to steal someone else's property, that he was apprehended. This move ended his insane journey, leaving behind the traces and terrible consequences of his actions. The investigators focused on finding Britney's body, and Joseph, with his grim, twisted mind, pointed out the suspected burial site on a map. The location was only a few hundred yards off Highway 95. When the body was discovered, it was in a terrible state of decomposition and initially impossible to identify visually. Only after a thorough check of dental records was it possible to identify the victim. The medical examiner found severe head trauma caused by blunt force. Britney had received 2 fatal blows with a hammer that crushed her skull. Even without the subsequent stabbing to the neck, these injuries would have been fatal. The specialist noted that if she had not been treated immediately, she would still have died from blood loss. When Britney's family and friends learned of the horrible fate, their shock was immense. How could this woman, who had shown such kindness, fall victim to betrayal by the man she had sheltered? From the beginning, her loved ones had questioned her decision to provide a home for a stranger and warned her of the possible danger. But Britney was confident in her ability to understand people and believed that her intuition would protect her from all threats. Alas, her gullibility turned to tragedy. Shortly before her disappearance, Britney repeatedly complained to friends about Joseph's irritable behavior. She found him rummaging through her personal belongings and noticed small amounts of money missing. Arguments between the two became frequent, and although Britney considered evicting the boyfriend, she failed to take any action before her tragic death. The police, as they continued to investigate, discovered that Joseph had been lying to Britney from the beginning. He had actually been homeless for a long time, and his heartbreaking story of a lost job and the need for temporary housing was just a mask for manipulation. The young man had been living in a tent on a beach in Florida, from where he elicited pity from kind-hearted people who allowed him to stay with them. This deception and his subsequent crimes showed how far he was willing to go for his own gain, and how his greed led to the tragic death of an innocent woman. Joseph Roberts often asked for help and told sad stories about his failures, skillfully evoking sympathy. No one could have imagined that his gratitude for their hospitality would turn into bloody payback. Despite the strangeness of the situation, it turned out that Joseph repeatedly deceived women, and several of them had already fallen for his tricks, taking him in. As with Britney, the criminal skillfully played the role of the victim, demonstrating mastery of manipulation. But as soon as he crossed the threshold of a new home, his behavior changed dramatically, turning the lives of his rescuers into a nightmare. Before meeting Britney, Joseph worked at a gas station where he became close to his boss, a woman who, like the others, sympathized with him. She offered him temporary housing, seeing him as a humble and decent man who spoke openly about his psychological problems. Joseph complained of depression and outbursts of uncontrollable anger, but skillfully concealed the true depth of his dark side. Those who gave him a roof over his head did not even realize that they were letting a potential threat into their home. Thus, from August 2008 to January 2009, he lived in the home of one of these women. At first, things were going well, as the gas station manager recalled. However, only a few weeks passed, and Joseph's mask began to fall off. He stopped looking after himself and started using drugs right in his room. Soon, the landlady politely asked him to leave, and surprisingly, Joseph calmly complied. He later recounted that he left voluntarily because, in this case, he was merely asked to leave rather than being rudely kicked out. As had happened with Britney, it was her abrupt behavior, he said, that caused her to pay with her life. A month after that, Joseph tried to repeat his stunt, turning to another gas station coworker, Cheryl Davenport. She didn't refuse his request for help either, offering to shelter him in exchange for help around the house and looking after her 3 young children. Joseph again played his role as the unfortunate victim, complaining about conflicts with his family and mental health issues allegedly driving everyone close to him away. After a short time, however, he showed his true colors again. He stopped washing and resumed his drug use. Naturally, this again led to his eviction, but, as the first time, without incident. Unfortunately, Britney was next in line. She failed to see Joseph as a threat before he took her life. In fact, all of the women who reached out to him could have been in her shoes. Britney just didn't know about the dark past and uncontrollable outbursts of anger that haunted Joseph for years. It was sad to realize that the man she had pinned her hopes on had become her executioner. Joseph played on people's kindness and trust, and each new victim brought him closer to the fatal line, beyond which stood Britney, the last person who risked giving him a chance at a new life. When thinking back on Britney, it is important to realize that her openness and desire to help others was the driving force behind her entire life. Even when her own dreams of Hollywood didn't come true, her kindness and sincerity continued to light the way for those who found themselves in difficult situations. Naively believing that her intuition and good heart would protect her from evil, Britney decided to offer shelter to Joseph Roberts, a man who seemed sincere and needy. Her decision to take Joseph in at one time was an act of selfless kindness, not a mistake. It was a manifestation of her natural inclination to help, though as she would soon discover, there was a dark side lurking beneath the mask of his harmless appearance. Unfortunately, Joseph Roberts took advantage of this trust. After Joseph's shocking confession, he was arrested on a charge of aggravated first-degree murder. Despite his attempts to use the insanity defense, a forensic examination determined that he was fully aware of his actions and fit to stand trial. However, the trial was not without complications. Arguments between the defense attorney and the prosecutor raised fears that Joseph might avoid a harsh sentence and end up under the care of a mental institution instead of prison. Eventually, after much negotiation, the parties reached an agreement. Joseph was offered a deal in which he agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder. The court accepted the offer, sentencing him to 30 years in prison. This decision deeply shocked Britney's loved ones, who felt that the punishment was clearly not commensurate with the cruelty and treachery with which Joseph had committed his crime. All their attempts to appeal the sentence proved futile. Thus, Joseph Roberts, who had once sought comfort and protection from women, found his new refuge within the walls of the prison. He spends the next 30 years in prison until he turns 56. She was once full of life, a beloved teacher, a friend, and a wife who seemed to have it all. But beneath the surface, her world was crumbling, slowly being strangled by the man she thought she knew and once loved. What had begun as a passionate love story soon turned into a nightmare of manipulation and abuse. He kept her on a tight leash, monitoring her every move, every call, and every conversation. Her bruises, hidden under layers of makeup and long sleeves, told a story she was too afraid to say out loud. He wasn't just cruel. His anger boiled over into a sadistic rage that she barely survived over and over again. He wasn't just fighting to keep her. He was determined that if he couldn't have her, no one else would. Ashley Scott was the one everyone knew as a friendly teacher and a caring friend. But behind that friendly image was another side of her life, one full of horror and violence. Friends and colleagues noticed how her eyes were gradually losing their former sparkle. No one knew that something much more sinister was going on in her home than just arguments and disagreements. Everyone knew that Ashley wanted a divorce, but for some reason she always backed out at the last minute. Ashley stubbornly refused to seek help from the police, believing it would only make matters worse. Her attempts to keep her family together, despite the constant violence, gradually turned into a death trap from which she could not escape. In the end, her unbearable faith in a possible reconciliation and fear of the unknown led her to the worst possible outcome, where love and fear merged in a tragic finale. On the eve of the tragedy, she received the long-awaited divorce papers, but the crucial steps seemed to remain insurmountable for her. Was it her mistake, or perhaps a death trap? This story is about how love can become a chain, and an attempt to free oneself from it turns into a death sentence. But what really happened behind the walls of that house in the last hours of her life? Why did someone who swore to love and protect her turn into a cold-blooded criminal? Ashley Scott was born in November 1978 in Bossier City, a city in Bossier Parish in the northwestern region of the U.S. state of Louisiana. The population is approximately 65,000. Her childhood was spent surrounded by care and love. Despite the early divorce of her parents, Ashley's mother, seeking to arrange a personal life, met a man named Dennis Youngblood, who not only became a stepfather but took the girl as his own and adopted her. Together, they created a warm family atmosphere in which Ashley grew up cheerful and confident. At school, she was popular, and her bright appearance attracted attention. Ashley was a real beauty. After graduating from high school in 1996, her life took a sharp turn. Ashley met a guy who, as it seemed to her at the time, became her true love. His name was Jeffrey Scott. He was attending Wasabi Baptist University in Arkansas at the time, and Ashley soon enrolled there as well. Even then, it seemed that their relationship was doomed to success. In 2000, after receiving her teaching degree, Ashley decided to dedicate her life to teaching children. Her dream of becoming a teacher was beginning to come true. But behind the facade of the ideal was something more sinister. The couple was inseparable, and Ashley literally glowed as she talked about how kind, caring, and understanding Jeffrey was. This image of the perfect guy was so convincing that Ashley agreed to marry him without hesitation. However, even at the wedding, it became noticeable that not everything was so smooth. Family and friends who traveled to Cord, a suburb of Memphis, to attend the festivities were wary. Jeffrey seemed friendly and courteous at first glance, but his mask of politeness hid his arrogance and contempt for Ashley's entourage. A few arguments broke out at the gala, and some of the guests began to question her choice. But Ashley, blinded by feelings, stubbornly defended her chosen one. Over time, this relationship poisoned her life. Gradually, Ashley became more and more distant from her family and loved ones. Jeffrey began to control her every move, and without realizing it, she found herself in the grip of a toxic attachment. Few friends remained close, but even they tried to keep their distance. In 2003, Ashley began teaching at a middle school in suburban Memphis, where she quickly gained the respect of her colleagues and the love of her students. Everything seemed to be going great for her at work, but a very different reality awaited her at home. These years became a struggle for Ashley between her personal and public image. At school, she remained smiling and friendly, but at home, she was losing herself, living under constant pressure. With each passing year, her bond with her family weakened, and her relationship with Jeffrey fell deeper and deeper into darkness and fear. Ashley rarely shared details of her personal life, claiming that her marriage and the move were purely her choice. She reassured those around her that everything that happened was the result of her own decisions. But these words hid a bitter truth. Her reasoning had long been influenced by a manipulator, her husband, Jeff. Even in the early stages of their relationship, he began implementing a typical abuser's plan, cutting Ashley off from friends and family. Isolation is the first step to total control. Jeff purposely destroyed her ties with loved ones, leaving her without support. Gradually, he switched to her self-esteem, undermining her confidence on a daily basis. Constant nagging, humiliation, and accusations became a regular part of her life. Ashley fell deeper and deeper into despair, feeling helpless and unwanted. Her only link to her old life was her best friend, Lori, whom she'd been friends with since 5th grade. Lori knew something was wrong and tried her best to support Ashley, but even she couldn't imagine the horror that would soon unfold at her friend's house. The most paradoxical thing about this story is that even in the midst of constant violence and fear, Ashley still seemed to have hope for a happy marriage. Shortly before the fateful day, Jeffrey bought a new house, which they were going to furnish together. Neighbors and acquaintances saw the couple choosing a place to live and discussing plans for the future. It seemed that between them, there really remained some illusion of happiness. Moreover, Ashley started taking medication to plan a pregnancy, which looked like a desperate attempt to find a drop of happiness in this nightmare. In the aftermath, this contradictory information stunned the investigators. How could such a display of marital harmony coexist with frightening stories of beatings and threats? Some speculated that Ashley was deliberately creating a semblance of normalcy in order not to arouse the suspicions of her increasingly dangerous husband. Others, however, believed it was much worse. Perhaps Ashley had become so psychologically dependent on Jeffrey that she could no longer imagine life without him, even in the face of obvious threats. November 23, 2006 was Thanksgiving Day. Memphis Emergency Services received a disturbing call from Jeffrey Scott. The man's cold and completely calm voice informed the dispatcher that his wife was unconscious. He clarified that she was still breathing but unresponsive to anything. Suddenly, another voice was heard in the background, someone grimly stating that the woman was probably dead. That was enough for the emergency operators to suspect something wrong. The call was immediately passed on to management, and police officers rushed to the scene, ready to confront something far more sinister than the usual accident. Police officers arrived on the scene within minutes. Upon entering the house, they went straight to the bedroom, where a woman lay motionless on the cold floor. Over her body leaned Dr. Robert McGee, who unsuccessfully tried to bring her back to life. It was his voice that the dispatcher could faintly hear in the background as Jeffrey Scott called for emergency services. But that wasn't what was strange. Jeffrey's very demeanor was literally etched into the memory of every officer who arrived at the call. Instead of panic or fear, he seemed suspiciously calm, as if everything that was happening was nothing more than a minor domestic nuisance. He spoke to the police with an icy coolness, claiming that he and his wife had been drinking the night before, and then Ashley had suddenly felt ill and gone to bed. In the morning, according to Jeffrey, he found her unconscious and first called his friend Dr. McGee, insisting that he'd come immediately. At that point, Dr. McGee was returning home with his family and was unable to get to him right away. When he did get to the Scott home, he was confronted with a frightening scene. His friend was standing next to his wife's lifeless body, and something heavy and ominous hung in the air. At once, McGee thought that there might have been a serious quarrel between the couple, which ended in tragedy. However, not wanting to make a fuss, he quickly drove his wife and children out, preferring to leave the situation within the family. Returning an hour later, McGee was horrified to realize that Ashley's condition was critical, if she was still alive at all. The doctor was certain that something far worse had happened here than a simple family quarrel. He urged Jeffrey to call an ambulance immediately. Realizing that he was facing a possible murder scene, McGee deliberately detained Jeffrey until the police arrived, sensing that the truth might be much darker than it first appeared. Soon, talking to the police, the doctor shared what he had long suspected about the troubled relationship in the Scott family. He knew that the couple's marriage had been on the rocks for a long time. Ashley was increasingly resorting to alcohol, and Jeffrey, losing control, regularly resorted to physical violence. Everything pointed to the fact that that evening was the culmination of a long and painful conflict. And now all that remained was to find out what exactly had happened behind the closed doors of the house where love had long ago turned into fear and despair. Jeffrey was immediately apprehended and sent to the patrol car. There, he adjusted his version of events, claiming that the scandal with his wife had erupted because of a text message from her alleged lover that he had accidentally discovered on her phone. However, while Jeffrey was trying to justify his actions, detectives began to examine the crime scene. The picture they discovered in the house only reinforced their dark suspicions. Ashley's passport, phone, and purse were on the kitchen table, neatly stacked next to a printed email and a laptop computer. Those details hinted at hasty packing, as if Ashley had been trying to leave the house quickly. But there was a clear sign of a struggle in the living room. Scattered items, a broken vase, and things pulled off shelves indicated panicked resistance. Both of the couple's cars were in the garage, and most alarmingly, Ashley's clothes were hanging on hangers inside. Ashley's Volkswagen on the garage floor had bedding with bloodstains on it. All indications were that she had planned to leave, but something had stopped her plans and apparently stopped them for good. The first person to assess Ashley's condition was a paramedic from the local medical service. He immediately noted the serious injuries that spoke for themselves. Severe blunt force trauma to the head, multiple contusions all over her body, on her legs, chest, and back. There was no blood pressure or pulse, and her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light. Particularly horrifying was the bloody vomit dripping from her mouth and nose, indicating internal injuries. The paramedic also noticed a distinctive green tint to the right ear, typical of injuries caused by multiple blows to the same spot. A huge bruise in the shape of a boot mark was clearly visible on her back, as if the woman had been stomped on while she was lying on the floor. When the doctors arrived, they tried to use a defibrillator 4 times and administer powerful drugs to bring Ashley back to life. But all were unsuccessful. Even after that, they continued to perform CPR, unwilling to give up. Eventually, she was rushed to the hospital. Surprisingly, on the way, Ashley's heart continued to barely beat, even though there was almost no chance of survival. The doctors realized that they were looking at a woman who had been tortured, and the fight for her life now depended only on a miracle. In the emergency room, the neurosurgeon quickly realized that the patient was at her limit, and her condition was beyond repair. Ashley's brain was in an agonal state. All of her body's systems were shutting down one by one, and her vital organs were beginning to fail. After several minutes of fighting for Ashley's life, surgeons made the decision to take her off life support. Ashley passed away, and her life was tragically cut short. With this horrific event, Jeffrey Scott came into the spotlight as the prime suspect in the crime. Charges were filed immediately, and he was taken into custody. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found over 50 hematomas throughout the deceased's body, many of which were in various stages of healing. These injuries indicated systematic violence and prolonged beating. The cause of death turned out to be a subdural hematoma on the right side of the brain, which caused a coma and massive internal bleeding. This injury led to cardiac arrest as the brain hit the walls of the skull, causing catastrophic bleeding and disrupting the oxygen supply to vital organs. The most gruesome thing about this tragedy is that if Ashley had received timely medical attention, perhaps her life could have been saved. But instead, her agony continued until it was too late. Under questioning, Jeffrey admitted that he didn't call his friend, a doctor, until 8 hours after the altercation. All this time, Ashley was in critical condition, not receiving the medical attention she needed, and desperately fighting for her life. According to Jeffrey, the conflict stemmed from suspicious messages from an alleged lover that he allegedly found on his wife's phone. In a fit of passion, he hit her in the head once and then sent her into the garage, throwing her a blanket and pillow, leaving her in the dirt amid torn bedding and bloodstains. Ashley, bloodied and severely traumatized, was forced to lie on the cold floor in pain and cold, while her husband rested peacefully in the bedroom. The trial of Jeffrey Scott began on January 13, 2009. In the dock was a man whose life and reputation were in danger of being destroyed. It centered on Lori, the victim's best friend, who shared her memories of troubling signs long before the tragedy. Beginning in November 2005, Jeff began calling Lori frequently, complaining about Ashley. He said that his wife had begun abusing alcohol, frequently fell, and suffered bruises whose origin she could not explain. According to him, Ashley blamed him for the abuse, but Jeff claimed that the true cause of her injuries was her own actions in bad company, especially a friend named Blair Brown. Lori thought the calls were strange and suspicious, believing that Jeff was thus trying to create an alibi for himself in case of domestic violence charges. Lori knew full well that Ashley had been the victim of systematic abuse that had gone on for years. At trial, Jeffrey presented a different version of events, claiming that his wife allegedly had several lovers. According to him, Ashley manipulated them by pretending to be a victim and professing her love, although she herself had no true emotions for them. Jeff even stated that he no longer wanted Ashley to be the mother of his child because of her lifestyle and general condition, which disgusted him. Shortly before the tragedy, the Scott couple were at dinner with the doctor who later tried to save Ashley. On the advice of this doctor, Jeff stopped restricting Ashley's communication with Lori. From that point on, Ashley resumed communicating with her friend, but her stories became dark and disturbing. She reported that Jeff was becoming increasingly aggressive and violent, humiliating and beating her almost daily. These words seemed plausible, especially given the state of her body. While Ashley had indeed begun to abuse alcohol, which partially confirmed what her husband had said, such massive bruises could not have been sustained simply from accidental falls. The injuries she had suffered spoke of systematic abuse, and what was happening to her was far from accidental or minor falls. In September 2006, Lori saw her friend Ashley for the last time when she visited for the weekend. During their trip to the store, Ashley wistfully told her how much control her husband Jeff had over her money and spending. She only bought the essentials, even though she clearly wanted many other things. Jeff called her almost nonstop, wondering what she was wearing and where she was. His insistence and attempts to cause Ashley conflict seemed like a veiled form of control and manipulation. Lori noticed that her friend avoided discussing their marriage, admitting that she was afraid to leave her husband because his reactions could be unpredictable and dangerous. She admitted to at least 3 people close to her that Jeffrey had repeatedly clutched her throat, leaving her exhausted and on the verge of death. Each time, she found excuses for his actions and convinced herself that things could still be fixed. This illusion of hope, which turned out to be fatal, cost her life. Not a month later, Ashley turned to Rachel, a divorce attorney, for help. Rachel understood the depth of Ashley's distress and tried to help, but unfortunately, she could not prevent disaster. Now her only task was to testify at the trial against Jeff, whom she believed was responsible for her client's murder. Ashley had gotten Rachel's phone number a year earlier, in August 2005, when she was arrested for drunk driving. At that time, Rachel had helped her avoid serious consequences, and then Ashley learned that the lawyer specialized in divorce proceedings. In her conversations with Rachel, Ashley shared frightening details about how Jeff physically abused her. She recounted how on the night she was arrested for drunkenness, Jeff had beaten her in a bar and kicked her home while taking her shoes from her. This incident frightened her to the point where she drove drunk so that she would not have to walk home at night barefoot. One of the most shocking episodes occurred when Jeffrey threw her dog out of the car in a fit of anger. For Ashley, it was a turning point. She could barely hold back tears and literally became hysterical. The animal miraculously survived but was severely injured and took weeks to recover. Despite the horror of the situation, Ashley again did not dare to go to the police. Her mind was clouded with guilt. Jeffrey had convinced her that the attack on the poor animal was supposedly her own fault. He skillfully manipulated her feelings, reducing the guilt to her misbehavior. It was a trap of psychological abuse from which Ashley could not find a way out. Ashley could not fully disclose the details of her fear and pain for fear of her husband's retaliation. She didn't have the funds to pay for an attorney, but Rachel, seeing the true victim of abuse in front of her, agreed to help virtually free of charge, charging only a token fee of $1. Rachel offered Ashley several possible ways out of her horrible situation, but Ashley admitted that she had already made attempts to escape, only to have her husband Jeff threaten to kill her if she tried it again. She revealed that Jeff had been aggressive since their time in college, but over the past year, his violence and bullying had reached a breaking point. Every day became a real challenge, where any action she took could be the spark that ignited his rage. The fear of her husband was so great that Ashley tried to drown it in alcohol to get through the unrelenting terror. For a year, Rachel and Ashley kept in contact, meeting in person or communicating via payphones to avoid suspicion from Jeff. Ashley was under constant scrutiny. Her husband checked her cell phone, demanding accountability for every text and call, and these checks often ended in arguments and new injuries. Friends and acquaintances constantly noticed the bruises on her body. Ashley recounted that Jeff beat her with his feet, preferring to knock her down and then kick her. The medical examiner confirmed these horrific accounts by finding shoe marks on her body. Meanwhile, Jeff was not shy about bringing home mistresses, and bluntly told Ashley that she disgusted him and that he did not want to be intimate with her. These humiliations and constant abuse plunged Ashley into a deep depression. She left her job and tried to cope with the pain with the help of alcohol, but only sank deeper into alcohol addiction. Over the past 6 months, her life had become a series of agonizing days, each of which she couldn't spend without a drink. Her hopes for salvation were melting away as her final strength melted away. Ashley's former co-workers, school principal, and teachers spoke at the trial. They all reported that they had become increasingly concerned about her condition in recent months. They noticed that Ashley constantly used a lot of makeup in an apparent attempt to cover up the beatings and wore long-sleeved clothing even in the hottest weather to cover up the bruise marks. These signs alerted colleagues, who urged Ashley to break off her relationship with Jeff and go to the police. They were convinced that her marriage had become a real danger, but despite the warnings, Ashley sought to avoid conflict and minimize problems. Even her students noticed that with each passing month before her death, she became more withdrawn and didn't socialize like she used to. The problems were obvious, but when asked, she would often give false explanations, hiding the real reasons for her depressed state. The most shocking details of the abuse came from Rachel, the divorce lawyer. After one particularly horrific incident, Rachel realized that her client was in mortal danger. Jeff wasn't just cruel, he was monstrously brutal. The shoe marks on Ashley's body were no accident. He often rolled her on the floor and then beat her with his feet. On one occasion, he even strangled her by stepping on her throat. Ashley, exhausted, begged him to stop, but Jeff, in a fit of rage, screamed that he wanted her dead. The day before her death, Ashley called Rachel to inform her that she had received the divorce papers. Rachel was in a different city at the time and couldn't take care of the case right away, but she insisted that Ashley leave her husband immediately. She recommended that she not communicate with Jeff, pack her things, and leave while he was away so as not to risk her life. This last hope of salvation, unfortunately, proved to be too late. Despite her growing sense of hopelessness and fear of the future, Ashley was determined to talk to her husband peacefully, to explain her decision and set the record straight. She gathered her things, carefully packing her clothes, passport, and important documents that were necessary for her departure. Everything was ready. She put her things in the car. However, despite Rachel's advice, who urged her to leave immediately and have no contact with Jeff, Ashley decided to take a chance and try to explain everything to her husband. That move proved to be fatal. Intriguing details surfaced about Blair Brown, Ashley's friend, whom Jeff hated intensely and considered the source of all his troubles. In fact, Blair knew Jeff far more deeply than was realized. She was his former lover and knew more about his darker side than anyone else. When Ashley had met Blair about 6 months before the tragedy, she had immediately felt supportive and sympathetic. Blair actively supported her during difficult times, and they often spent time together to take her mind off her problems. Blair became a sort of refuge for Ashley, a place she could escape to after particularly terrible conflicts with her husband. One day, Jeff, desperate to find his wife, tracked her down at Blair's house. Suddenly breaking into his ex-lover's house, he created a real nightmare. He hit Ashley several times, then threw her out into the street, leaving her in a terrible state. Despite these blatant acts of violence, Ashley continued to refuse to go to the police, not wanting to complicate an already difficult situation. Thanks to Blair, who became a key witness, a new significant figure in Ashley's life became known in court. A few months before the tragedy, Ashley had been in a relationship with a man named Michael Lowe. The relationship was more than just a fling. Michael became for her a symbol of a new life and a hope for a future free of violence and fear. They planned a future together after the divorce, and Ashley was already planning to move in with Michael. But alas, her dreams never came true. At the trial, Michael Lowe confirmed that their romance developed rapidly and seriously. According to him, on the day when the crime occurred, they talked on the phone several times. Ashley was in high spirits, preparing to finally end her relationship with Jeff and start a new life with him. Michael recounted that Ashley seemed determined and hopeful, as her plans centered on a radical life change. To corroborate Michael's words, text messages that Ashley and Michael exchanged via social media were decrypted. These correspondences became an important piece of evidence. They contained not only plans for the future, but also intimate photos that Ashley sent to Michael between October 29th and November 22nd, 2006. Printouts of these messages were found in Jeff's home after police arrived there. The discovery was shocking. It confirmed that Jeff was aware of his wife's new relationship, and it was likely that this information could have been the reason for his aggressive behavior. The evidence uncovered painted a frightening picture. Not only had Jeff learned of his wife's affair, but he was probably experiencing mania, jealousy, and rage. This emphasized the danger Ashley was in and added to the tragic nature of her final days. That terrible evening, as the conflict reached its climax, Jeff showed Ashley the correspondences found on her laptop. These messages, revealing her affair with Michael Lowe, were the catalyst for the gruesome fight. Ashley, in desperation, tried to run away, but Jeff was willing to do anything to keep her from leaving. His aggression reached its peak when he beat her to a pulp. Eventually, Ashley managed to get to the garage, but there was an even greater tragedy waiting for her. She received a fatal blow to the head and lost consciousness. Jeff, realizing her condition was critical, just threw blankets and pillows on the floor without bothering to call an ambulance. At that point, he clearly didn't care if Ashley was still alive or not. In his own words, this all happened around 1 a.m., but it wasn't until 9 a.m., when he had already recovered from the first wave of shock, that he finally carried Ashley back into the house and laid her in front of the fireplace, hoping the warmth would help her regain consciousness. Later, he planned to move her to the bedroom. It wasn't until about 8 hours later, when Dr. Robert McGee, tired from the overnight trip, arrived at the house that he immediately realized the seriousness of Ashley's condition. The doctor saw that there was almost no chance of survival. But even after that, Jeff continued to remain silent. Emergency services were not called until 12 hours after her injuries, when she was already on the verge of life and death. These hours without medical attention showed that Jeff realized how severely injured his wife was. But instead of seeking help, he left her to fend for herself. Prosecutors argued that he deliberately delayed, hoping Ashley would die and he wouldn't have to be held responsible. During the trial, the dispatcher who took the call said that the conversation with Jeff was incredibly cold and indifferent, as if he was just ordering at a fast food place. Even after Ashley was taken to the hospital and Jeff himself was in police custody, he was more interested in who won the last soccer game than his wife's condition. This complete callousness and detachment only emphasized how insignificant to him was the life of the woman he was about to build a future with. Jeffrey Scott's attorney tried to convince the court that Ashley was suffering from alcoholic ketoacidosis, a condition that can cause seizures and falls. In his opinion, these seizures could have been the cause of the injuries Jeffrey described when he was socializing with Ashley's girlfriend. Despite the apparent absurdity of this argument, there was an independent expert who confirmed this theory, adding more confusion to the case. To disprove this theory, another expert had to be brought in, the county's assistant medical examiner. He reported shocking details, more than 50 hematomas on the victim's body, which clearly could not be the result of accidental falls. The shoe marks on Ashley's body were especially terrible. These marks indicated that her body had been jumped on. Her beatings were systematic and brutal. Forensic examination established that the cause of death was a head injury, which could only have occurred after multiple severe blows to the same point on the head. This clearly disproved the idea of accidental falls. Jeffrey's attorney also insisted that the defendant was not an aggressor but a victim, a man struggling to save his marriage to a woman who sent intimate photos to another man and abused alcohol. The defense attorney portrayed Jeffrey as a desperate husband who, upon learning of the affair, lost his temper and made a fatal mistake. Despite these arguments, prosecutors will emphasize that Ashley's last hours were hell. She tried to leave her husband, but not to hide, hoping for at least some kind of peaceful conversation. This decision turned out to be fatal. Ashley desperately tried to hide the reality of her marriage, each time embellishing the situation to loved ones and trying to find excuses for her husband's behavior. She convinced herself and others that provocation or random circumstances were to blame for everything. But she stubbornly refused to admit the obvious. A cruel and dangerous monster lived next to her. When the jury retired to deliberate on the verdict, no one expected this turn of events. When they returned, they found Jeffrey Scott guilty of only second-degree murder. This verdict was so shocking that even the judge expressed his displeasure. He emphasized that Jeffrey Scott could have called for help and saved Ashley's life from the beginning, but instead continued to watch her condition deteriorate with indifference, indicating his intent to let her die. The judge considered this a premeditated murder, not an accidental occurrence. Nevertheless, the verdict came down, and Jeffrey Scott was sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. He is serving his sentence at the Bledsoe County Correctional Complex in Pikeville, Tennessee. Jeffrey will remain in prison until April 2030, when his sentence expires, remaining a symbol of justice that was not completely fair. After the tragedy of Ashley Scott murder, the National Domestic Violence Hotline conducted a frightening study. It turned out that women who survive strangulation by a partner are 10 times more likely to be victims of reprisal in the next conflict. This statistic seemed to foreshadow the fate of Ashley, who, despite all the horrors, continued to believe in the possibility of saving her marriage.